The clock has started.
I feel fine.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
I feel the liftoff.
This is a new and strange environment.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Good evening. Welcome to Slightly Off Axis podcast. I'm your host, Ken, and we have Carl Alessi tonight. Welcome, Carl.
Hi, Ken. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, if the audience will bear with me, I'm going to lean off to the side view so that I can read about Carl. Carl grew up in Orange County, California during a time when several of his family friends worked on the Apollo project. A lifelong devotee of the manned space program, he has published articles on the history of NASA's early attempts to piece together a strategy to land men on the moon by the end of the 1960s. When offered the opportunity to participate in the project that became the documentary Searching for Skylab, he leapt at the chance to write a screenplay for what he recognized was a fascinating and worthy component of NASA's early history to forge a pathway for humans to live and work in space. And he's now working on a book about the development and use of the Apollo Lunar Module. So my first question to Carl is, how did you become interested in space and at what age?
Well, as you were saying, I grew up in Orange County, and at that time we had a few people that were working in the industry. I had a friend down the street whose father was working on the second stage of the Saturn V in Seal Beach. We knew other people that were over in Downey working on the command service module and so on. But I was just captivated by the whole thing right from the get-go. With Alan Shepard in 1961, you'd have the teacher roll in a TV, on a big Soviet Union style thing with the rabbit ears, and we'd watch the launches. And I tried never to miss a single one. And I've had that fascination ever since, and I still do to this day.
Okay, and my next question, as I do this off camera, because I realized that I forgot to change one of my settings that improves my internet connection. Now let me bring myself back.
There you are.
What is your educational background? And before you answer that, I want to say hello to our audience. We have Heidi out there. We have Dwight out there. And you're going to tell us later who Dwight is. But Dwight, of course, says you are an absolute legend, which we all agree to. Okay, so that question was, what's your educational background?
Oh, it's nothing much to speak of. I have a BA in theater. So I've explored that a little bit earlier in my life, but life intercedes, you have to make a living. But my avocation in a lot of ways has always been space. And a little bit more recently in my life, I've done my best to explore the idea of being something of a space historian, in large part because both Alexandra and Dwight, who are in the chat room here, gave me that opportunity to write the talk track for Searching for Skylab, but also to publish some articles and now to start working on a book that I am deep into research for, to the point where I can scarcely hold conversations with normal human beings anymore. I'm so immersed in detail.
I feel like that sometimes in my own career. What specifically made you become an author?
I think that passion that I have is something that I can translate to other people in the written word, with some degree of clarity and some degree of context and continuity. I'm no good with numbers. I'm terrible at math, but I'm okay with words. I come up with a lot of oh yeahs and says yous from time to time, but nonetheless, I can usually communicate a story and talk about fact and talk about history, and history in general has been a passion of mine. So the idea of exploring some of these things in more challenging ways, in particular going into a book form now, which is what I'm venturing forth into, is rewarding and time consuming. and it's going to take a long time, but it's just something I feel pretty good about in general.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question. When did you write Searching for Skylab? What year was that?
Oh, gee. How long was that ago, Dwight and Alexandra? I mean, it's probably been something like 4 or 5 years at least by now, I think, since we started venturing forth in production for that particular documentary. So we worked on it together. Dwight and Alexandra live in Deutschland, and I'm out here in Orange County, California. So we would telecommute, so to speak, over the web. And Dwight would say, I need a talk track for this particular sequence. Let me give you the rough cut of it. And I would write it out and I would speak to it and check it for timing, make sure that it timed out with what he had sent me, edit it, and then send it back to him. And that was generally our workflow for assembling all that over several months as we had it in production.
Okay, we're going right through these questions quickly. Describe your latest project, which has to do with the Apollo era.
Okay, well, I did publish a two-part article a few years back on the adoption of the mode for getting to the moon by the end of the 1960s, and that's something called lunar orbit rendezvous. And it was a particular technique that was advocated very strenuously by an engineer named John C. Hubbold. And I thought his story was a very interesting one. I thought the idea of how we adopted that mode and why, and what it took to get NASA to recognize the validity of it was a thrilling historyscape to write about. So I did that. And then now that I wanted to go on to something else and something that was more broad-based and more challenging, a logical continuity for me was to write about the Apollo Lunar Module, which is what came out of Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, the idea of having a dedicated landing craft solely to get to the surface of the moon, get people back again to the mothership, the command service module. And so that's what led me into this particular chapter of my life, which I work on when I'm not working, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Now, you related this story to me when we were going through our testing phase for tonight's show. And you told me that you had a special experience, a behind-the-scenes experience, something to do with the space program. What was that?
Oh, Lord. I don't know what that was when I told you about it. I mean, there have been a few here and there. I think
feel free to relate multiple ones then.
Okay. Once in a while, you get lucky in terms of bumping into people that are involved in the program that you run into purely by serendipity. And I think the one I told you about was when I went to a performance by John Fugelsang a few years ago in Venice, California, and I was wearing my NASA jacket. This is the jacket I have with Apollo patches all over it and NASA symbols. And people will walk up to me in grocery stores and say, "Are you an astronaut?" And I just say, "No, I'm just a space geek," which is an answer my wife told me to always give people, a nice short way to go about it. But this fellow saw it and he goes, "Well, I work for Jet Propulsion Laboratory out in Pasadena." And that eventuated into going to take a tour, a personal tour of JPL, and seeing the Perseverance Mars rover being assembled in the clean room, among other things. I got to see the Mars yard. I got to see mission control. That was very cool. Some organizations I'm a member of, I've been allowed to do things like go to the 25th anniversary of the Apollo 12 cruise flight down in San Diego and talk to all of them. I've gone to Space Fest in Arizona and had dinner with people like Jim McDivitt, who was the commander of Apollo 9 and the first person to ever fly a lunar module, by the way. Things like that. Those are things that are precious moments in my life that are seldom to be repeated again, that really contributed a lot to me in terms of memory and in terms of stories that I can build on and actually integrate into what I'm writing in some cases.
So there's a comment here. That's a lie. Carl flew on an unknown space mission, Boomerang 1, launched by Australia in 1995.
Oh, now, Dwight, come on. You're just telling a story there. That's not true. There's no such thing. Come on, mate.
Okay. Next question is, have you witnessed a launch in person?
Well, you'd have to define that by distance. Out here in Anaheim, California, I can see launches that take place from Vandenberg. If the lighting is correct during sunset, I can get some spectacular pictures sometimes of Falcon 9s and the rest that are lifting off from there. Kennedy Space Center, the only time I got to see an actual launch was from Kissimmee at our hotel, and that's like 50 miles away. And I was able to watch a Falcon 9 lift off from there.
And the odd thing is, living here in the Kennedy Space Center area, is there are times when you can be behind a cloud front, you can be closer and see nothing, and that person 50 miles away or 100 miles away or 250 miles away will see something that you don't see anything of.
Mm-hmm.
And then the only way we'll know it actually went up is that we'll either see the light flash, sort of, or hear the rumble.
Yeah, as it permeates down below the cloud deck.
And then, you know, the dynamics of that rumble change with the wind pressure, the wind direction, so forth. I have one more question, but obviously I'd like to get into the presentation before I ask you the final question. So you did mention that article. Would you like to go over that together?
Sure. Just you go ahead and drive and I'll follow if you want to ask questions from it or want me to set it up in any other way beyond what I did earlier. I'll be glad to do that if you like.
I'm getting the first part, and I'm going to want to do some tweaks to get us in the right place. And you can see the picture sort of.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And that is a rather famous picture, actually, of John C. Hubble, who was that engineer I mentioned earlier, who was working for the Space Task Group out of Langley, Virginia, for NASA. And for those of you who have not heard of Langley or have not seen very much about it, Langley is actually the oldest field center for what became NASA later, going way back to practically the beginning of the 20th century. The Space Task Group, in turn, that he worked for, ultimately became the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. And back around the time that President Kennedy committed us to go to the moon by the end of the 60s, there were three main ideas afloat in the community for how we ought to do that. And one of those was called direct ascent. And that's sort of an Occam's razor sort of thing. You know, the simplest way to do something is usually the right way to do it or the best explanation. And you build a big spaceship, you fly it directly to the moon, land it, take off part of it from there, and come directly back to Earth. But the problem with that is it would require an enormous booster to do this. We're talking about a booster that would have not 5 F1 engines, as a Saturn V did, but 8 of them. And when you start expanding upon all of that in terms of how big it is, trying to get it built, trying to transport those elements around the country, ultimately to wherever the launch site was going to be, what kind of launch site you could have. Would it be something floating out at sea? Would it be on land? Where would it be? It just became something that was impossible to realize within the decade. It just wasn't terribly practical. So the next idea that was on the table was something called Earth Orbit Rendezvous. And this is a mode that people like Wernher von Braun in particular really liked. You don't need one big rocket. You could have a couple of smaller ones. You could go ahead and assemble your spacecraft in Earth orbit after a rendezvous. And then you could do kind of like what you did with direct ascent. Take that assembled spaceship, send it directly to the moon, bring it directly back. And John C. Hubble is just saying, no, this is all wrong. You've got it wrong. This is not going to work practically. And it's not going to work because what you're talking about is landing a craft on the moon that's capable of returning to Earth with all of its heavy heat shielding. This is not reasonable. What you need is something that's lighter than that, something that's dedicated for that job. You need a landing craft that is purely a landing craft and is dedicated and designed to only that particular role. That's lunar orbit rendezvous. Now, that was the dark horse in this whole competition out of those three modes. People are saying, look, wait a minute. Look, it's dicey enough to try to rendezvous in Earth orbit. We've never done anything like that before. We don't know if we can do it. But what you're telling us now is that you're going to have the lives of your astronauts depend on rendezvousing and docking in an orbit around the moon. And if it doesn't work, they die there. No. Well, eventually, this idea obviously won out. And it's something that we could do. And it's something that did succeed. And it was something that was eminently practical. But what you see in the story of the development of that lunar module, nonetheless, is this constant fight to get the weight of the lunar module down, to make it light enough for the Saturn V to lift and do its job. And John C. Hubble himself, when he was giving his estimates to what a lunar module ought to be, really drastically underestimated how heavy it ought to be. I mean, he was thinking around the lines of like maybe 10,000 pounds, and it ended up being more than triple that, well more than that. So that was quite a struggle to pull off. But eventually they did. It was a constant fight all the way through the 1960s to get it light enough and still get it to work. And they've got it to work almost at the last minute in 1969, as it turns out. I should point out, too, something that's interesting about Hubble's story. Hubble, in his struggle to get NASA to realize the validity of his idea, he couldn't get people to listen to him. He had people, he would go into, this literally happened once, I recounted in this article, where Hubble went into a meeting with some senior NASA brass, and one of those people in the meeting was a man named Max Faget, lead designer for NASA, guy that designed the Mercury space capsule, or headed the team that did it. And he's going through his figures and facts and why this made sense. And pretty much in the middle of that meeting, Max stands up and he goes, his figures lie. Now imagine being shouted down in front of everybody in a meeting like that. So finally, in the final analysis, what Hubble had to do was write this very famous letter to an associate administrator for NASA named Bob Siemens. And it started off with this line, somewhat as a voice in the wilderness. And he went on to try to recount his struggle, what he was proposing, why it was a good idea. And he would ask in this letter questions like, do we want to get to the moon or not? Rather abrupt and rather to the point. He was like that, of course. So he sent it that way. A lot of people that heard about the letter or got copies of it said, this guy's gone over everybody's head. What does he think he's doing? And Siemens said, you know, I've heard about this idea. It's been in the community for a while. I think we ought to be asking some more questions and be open-minded to it. And in the end, the idea won out. So sometimes if you go over people's heads, sometimes you win. And as Forrest Gump once said, that's all I have to say about that right now. Unless you have any questions. Ken, I cannot hear you. I think you're speaking, but I can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, I muted it when I was drinking.
I wasn't sure if you were waiting for me to talk more.
Let's just try that again.
Okay.
I was reading the article while you were speaking, and I note that you touched on most of the topics that were in the article that you wrote. And what I find fascinating is that SLS and Starship, the lunar incarnation that's supposed to happen, It almost sounds like what this article describes as Nova. Starship almost seems like it's doing what was envisioned as Nova, big, huge, giant rocket landing on the moon. Is that your impression as well, or no?
Not really, although there are some aspects to it that bother me a little bit, to tell you the truth. And they come from things that are mentioned in this article. There's still always an element of rendezvous that's involved in any of these measures. In the case of Starship, you have to have a rendezvous with another Starship in Earth orbit to refuel. That's for one. One of the things that bothers me a little bit that would have been true of direct ascent and landing a huge machine on the moon is that Starship is indeed pretty big and pretty tall with a pretty narrow footprint. And that very concept of having that kind of lander is something that threw a lot of engineers in NASA away from a vehicle like that. How are we going to guide it down to the moon? Will it fall over? The only way our pilot can see his way to the landing site is to build some kind of platform off the side of the vehicle and then jettison that platform upon ascent after you don't need it anymore. And we just couldn't figure out how to make any of that really work. Now, granted, Starship would have more advanced imaging and radar capability to do the landing. That's quite true. But you still have to wonder whether or not this thing is going to fall over when it lands. It does bother me a bit.
Mm-hmm. It is a challenge. We've seen some audience interaction while you've been speaking.
Oh, good.
And let me see. We had Dwight, who worked with you on the film, say, I sent Carl a rough cut of the film, and he had pretty much blindly right to the pictures that was on that cut. I do not envy the job that he had, of course, talking about searching for Skylab. Alexandra said, what a brain. Heidi invited you to, the next time you're near the Kennedy Space Center, to come watch a launch, call me and talk to me.
I will.
Siemens was very crucial to make sure a TV camera was there to shoot the first step on the lunar surface. I'm sure that's a comment about the Apollo landing.
Yeah, Dwight actually wrote a book about that, by the way, Live TV from the Moon. That's how we met, actually. It was over
I'm sure this comment by Alexandra is about the lessons learned in the first moon landing. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Alexandra. So I don't know if there's anything. There is a drawing in your article.
Oh, the three modes, I believe.
Right. The direct, where you just leave Earth, spin around Earth, partially spin around, and just then land on the moon.
Well, actually, you pretty much go directly in, like Surveyor did. If you remember the old Surveyor landers in the 60s that were unmanned. And obviously, there's some degree of, not straight in like you're hitting a bullseye on a target, but there's not any orbiting first and then selecting a landing site and then coming down. That's true of both of those modes, direct ascent and Earth orbit rendezvous.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll notice that there are complete orbits in the lunar orbit rendezvous diagram at the right. It doesn't really show that distinctly, but that's what obviously happens.
Now, they tested rendezvous in the pre-Apollo program, the Mercury. And then
in Gemini.
Gemini, yeah. And,
yeah.
were those launched on the same rocket? I don't really remember.
Well, Gemini was, no, they were not. Gemini was designed after Lunar Orbit Rendezvous was adopted officially in 1962 to test out the concepts of rendezvous and docking, as well as EVA and other things like long duration spaceflight. Gemini flew on an Air Force missile, an ICBM called the Titan II. And the Titan II had to be man-rated first, which took more work than you might think, and used hypergolic propellants. It didn't use things like kerosene and LOX. It used things like Aerozine 50 and nitrogen tetroxide, the kinds of fuels that you use in things like the Lunar Module and the Command Service Module that combust upon ignition. And that was the booster you used for that. The Aeginas that they docked with did use an Atlas D, which were the same rockets that were used in Mercury.
Okay. Alexandra did say that, reiterate what I thought, that Hobart fighting for his idea, though that was great, the lessons learned. Dwight said, how did you research to know exactly what to write for the script for Searching for Skylab?
Well, Google is your friend if you know what to pick from. And that had a lot to do with it. And I have a large library of material here to be able to extract information from. So primarily that kind of thing. There's just so much in the public domain that one can get a hold of these days. It's very different from when I was a kid and I was going to the library and Xeroxing stuff all the time. So if you are willing to look and willing to diligently get the information, you can get it in most cases. Sometimes it takes a lot of work to do it, but that's primarily what I did in that case and what I'm still doing to this day on projects I work on now.
Sorry, I thought you were going to talk a little bit longer, so I took a break and drank some water again. Dwight said, Carl, what is your favorite moment in the Skylab mission? And if you're going to discuss that in the presentation that we have coming up, you might want to wait at that point. I don't know.
Yeah, you're right about that, because probably, and I think Dwight and Alexandra know this, that my favorite thing about the mission probably is the way they rescued Skylab from destruction. Because Skylab, which for folks who don't know, is America's very first space station that was launched in 1973 and was visited by 3 different crews at different times and was damaged terribly upon launch due to an accident. And it took the work of a lot of people to make sure that that damage was corrected, that it could become habitable afterwards and had the power to be able to allow the crews to do the science that they needed and wanted to do. It's just a fabulous story. It's very much like the kind of thing that was done in Apollo 13, if you will, that same kind of effort and dedication and imagination to put all the pieces together when the clock was ticking on them to get it done. So I do look forward to talking with you about that and during the presentation to explain why I think that's such a cool thing in NASA's history.
Okay. And I'm going to put the links to your article in chat later. So I'm going to keep those in mind for later. But
Thank you.
Shall we get into the presentation?
Let's do that. And you were going to run that, right? And I'll just tell you when to advance.
Right. So let's get into the presentation. So this is the beginning.
Okay. And I'll just take it from here. Well, this obviously kind of doesn't bury the lead in a sense, because it tells you that, sure, there was an accident when Skylab was launched. Now, Skylab, to again go back to some basics on this, the idea about Skylab is that back in the mid 1960s, when Apollo was really being built up and all this effort was undertaken to get us to the moon, NASA was already beginning to think forward about what do we do when the lunar program eventually ends? How do we apply all this hardware, all these facilities, all this technology to something that's more future oriented? And, there are ideas about lunar observatories, Earth orbital observatories, and of course, a space station. And that became something called Apollo Applications, and that ended up becoming Skylab. And what happened is that to develop Skylab, in the three-stage Saturn V, the third stage, which is known technically as the S4B stage, one that was built just a few miles from where I'm sitting now in Huntington Beach, California, was converted into a space station with an orbital workshop and a docking adapter and an airlock module and a telescope array built into it. And we can start to see that if we go into the next couple of slides here. So feel free to advance when you're ready.
Okay.
So some of the elements involved, in other words, stuff that got broken. That's what we're going to focus on quite a bit here over the next few moments here. What happened? How did it get broken? How did they end up fixing it? And please go to the next slide. So here's what Skylab looked like on top of a Saturn V and what happens in the cutaway here. You can see it taking the place of a normal third stage up at the top, the S4B, right? And Skylab itself consisted of these core components, one of which was called the orbital workshop. You can see that in the lower right. That's where the astronauts would spend most of their time living and working. And that volume of space that you have in there to do that living and working is far bigger than any single module of the International Space Station. It's a huge area, really, for them to work in. They had a bathroom in there. They had a shower, they had living quarters, they had all of this stuff inside of it. They could even run around inside of it like hamsters around the periphery of the inside of Skylab and cartwheel and have fun. You'll see that in the movie if you watch it. Atop that is the Saturn V instrument unit. All Saturn Vs had that. That's sort of the brain of the launch vehicle that commands it what to do and when to do it. Then on top of that, more dedicated stuff for Skylab. An airlock module. Why do you need that? You need that for the astronauts to do EVAs, to do spacewalks. Why do you need that? Well, for one thing, if you look up at the very top up there, which you can pretty much see on the label, you have something called an Apollo telescope mount. That is something that has cameras and it becomes an observatory where the astronauts could shoot film of solar activity and other things. Comets when they came by, the comet Kohoutek that came by that year, 1 year. And all that stuff, of course, remember, is we're talking about 1973 here, right? You don't shoot things digitally and then just load them onto a flash drive. All this stuff is shot to film in film magazines. The astronauts had to go outside, go to those film magazines and retrieve them and bring them back inside. Also, you've got a multiple docking adapter. That's where the Apollo Command Service Module would dock to deliver the crews and ultimately, of course, later on bring them home. You can go to the next slide. Here's a big cutaway on this one, and this is what it should have looked like in orbit. You can see again in this guy, the Apollo telescope mount, pardon me for the typo on that. Apollo does not have two P's in it, but one of these days I'll fix that in Photoshop. Has rotated around in orbit from its inline position it was in before and is oriented at a right angle now, and its solar panels have extended out. So you've got 4 panels on there to help supply power. You can also see 2 solar wings extending from the sides of the orbital workshop to supply most of the power to the station. Those are tucked tightly against the orbital workshop during launch. They extend out only after you get into orbit. And if you look at the far right, you'll notice that there's mention of something very critical to our story here, a micrometeoroid shield. This shield was wrapped entirely around the orbital workshop, that whole big living space that the astronauts lived in. And it would stay that way until you got to orbit. And once you got into orbit, then it would expand out just slightly to stand away a little bit from the orbital workshop so it could do 2 jobs. One is to obviously deflect micrometeoroids that might be coming your way, and also to provide shading against solar heating. It's a sunshade as well. The way that Skylab worked in orbit is that orbited the Earth in something called solar inertial attitude, it always presented the same side towards the sun, no matter where it was in its Earth orbit. And so that shield helped to keep Skylab decently cool against that kind of heating. That's the way it should have looked. Let's find out how all that changed. If you'd like to go to the next slide. Now, here's a diagram of the micrometeoroid / sun shield or solar shield. And the idea behind this thing, it kind of looks like a big girdle, doesn't it? The idea behind it, as I said, is to remain tightly bound against the orbital workshop until you get into space. Then you fire some ordnance and it comes loose on these joints, on these butterfly hinges and so forth, so it can stand off away from the space station. And that way, heat, again, is dissipated and doesn't reach the space station itself. Also, another key player in all of this, and our dramatis personae in this story, you'll notice is something over on the far right, a little label down there, removable panel for scientific airlock. You can see that over on the right. There was a scientific airlock built into the orbital workshop that would permit the crews to extend experiments into that little airlock. It's small. It doesn't allow for people to go into it. That becomes a key component later in saving the workshop. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, here's Skylab being hoisted into its position in the vehicle assembly building at Kennedy Space Center. And a few of the things you can see here as it's being lifted in is that big micrometeoroid shield wrapped around the orbital workshop. It's black, it's got some white in it and so forth along the way. It does not have a J2 engine at the bottom. It's not a normal S4B anymore. It doesn't have any propellants in it to speak of. It's just a big space station that's going to have other components stacked on top of it. Below that is the second stage of the Saturn V. And I'm going to spend some time talking about that second stage a little bit, because that second stage to the Saturn V also had a key role in the accident and suffered some damage in the accident as well. One thing I'd like you to notice is that there are 4 little motors, little rocket motors around that conical shape at the top of it. Those are retro rockets that are necessary to fire when the second stage separates from Skylab in orbit. They fire for about 2 seconds, cause it to have some retrograde motion to it, and allow it to separate cleanly from Skylab. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is Skylab being rolled out of the VAB on its way to pad 39A out at Kennedy Space Center. A couple things here to look at that are kind of interesting. You'll notice that big white vertical stripe in the middle of Skylab. That's one of the solar arrays, one of the solar wings. It's folded neatly against the workshop. It's not going to come out until you get into orbit, and then it swings all the way out and extends 3 panels out of it. There's one just like it on the other side. Solar Array System 1 and Solar Array System 2. They each have their own number. The other thing that's kind of interesting on this one, if you look up at the very top, there's that payload shroud that surrounds things like the airlock module, the multiple docking adapter, and the Apollo telescope mount. That's all enclosed inside of that. And at the very top of that, you've got an anti-sway bar. You see that topmost dual beam thing going out and connecting to the tip of the payload shroud? Mm-hmm. That's designed to keep the Saturn from swaying too much when you move it on the crawler transporter. And you would even have it fastened while the Saturn was on the pad if there were any kind of winds that are in excess of a certain speed, to make sure, again, it didn't sway too much. Because any Saturn V, including this one, the only hard attachment it has to anything is at the very base of the first stage, to 4 hold down clamps down there. So that anti-sway bar gives you a little extra measure of stability when you need it, in this case. Before launch, of course, what it does is it swings up vertically out of the way, and it's kept there until the launch phase, of course, is over. Next slide. So here's launch. There you go. Happened on May 14th, 1973. Nice day that day. There is a cloud deck. You were talking about clouds that form up out there at KSC from time to time. There was a cloud deck that day too. So past a certain altitude, that space vehicle is going to pass through that deck and people just won't be able to see it anymore, which coincidentally is where our accident is about to happen, past where people can get a good look at things. So here it is on its way up. Of course, once you clear the launch tower, Houston takes control of the vehicle at that point. But otherwise, the vehicle is proceeding on its own recognizance here with the guidance that's formed from the instrument unit at the top of Skylab. All Saturn V's have an instrument unit that does the same kind of stuff. It has its own launch vehicle digital computer. It's got its own inertial measurement unit to know where it is in space, where it's pointing, all that good stuff. So it comes off the pad, it does a roll maneuver, then it does a pitch maneuver to head out over the Atlantic, and the instrument unit is telling it to do all that stuff. Okay, next slide. Here's where it gets interesting. Now, the thing about a Saturn V, when you look at it or consider it, it's an amazing fact about it, sitting on the pad at 0 miles per hour, about 61, 62 seconds later, it's exceeding the speed of sound, this thing that's the size of a Navy destroyer. And obviously, as it's doing that through dense atmosphere, it's dealing with aerodynamic pressure. And any rocket that's going into space goes through a region called max Q, maximum aerodynamic pressure on the vehicle. Skylab isn't quite there yet when this problem occurs. It's very close to it, almost there, but not quite there. But sure enough, pressure is building up on it. What's happening, and what should not have happened at this point, is that there is an auxiliary tunnel. You can see the label there towards the bottom, built into the micrometeoroid shield that should be sealed. And there are some boots at the bottom of it that are leaking. And air is pushing its way up underneath that tunnel and up underneath the micrometeoroid shield. Now, it's common in design in aerospace vehicles to have vents of different sorts on different parts of a space vehicle that may have air in them that need to vent out. The solar shield did too here, this micrometeoroid shield. It also had vents in it. But all this pressure is becoming so great, it's exceeding the capacity of those vents to vent that air out. And it starts popping out of the top of the auxiliary tunnel. It starts pushing the micrometeoroid shield away from the orbital workshop. And you can see that by about 62.74 seconds, as the slide indicates, it's starting to actually force it away right into that gargantuan airstream. And things start to get a little bit ugly at that point. Let's go to our next slide. Here's a series of 6 diagrams that kind of explain how this happened over time. At the top in the upper left, you can see it a little bit after the slide we just looked at, that this all starts to peel away like a label off a soup can, as we said in the movie. It starts ripping off, peels away towards one of the solar wings, to the point where it causes one of those solar wings, solar wing 2, to start deploying. Now it's pushing out, it's unhinged, it's coming away from the orbital workshop into the slipstream, and it stays there for now. What happens now is that the micrometeoroid shield, as you can see on the lower left, it actually starts to come apart in pieces. And one of those pieces ends up actually falling right into the Saturn V's adapter between Skylab and the second stage. You can see that in the lower left. It knocks a hole in there. And NASA knew that because they could start to detect in their telemetry air pressure building up inside that adapter. It's probably because something holed it, gouged it out. And that's what happened here. The rest of it continues to unravel. And towards the lower right corner, it actually comes around to that other solar wing and pins it in place. So it doesn't deploy, but it's trapped with a piece of debris, a big metal strap that goes over it. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Do you think that
Sure.
that a lot of this happened because they were trying to minimize the weight of Skylab and not add additional components that would have to be discarded? Because what I'm thinking now, in the modern day, we have the SpaceX, and it has a fairing, and those fairings have to separate, and then the satellite is exposed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think they didn't put all that on because they were trying to minimize the weight?
Well, you're always trying to do that, obviously, in rocketry and in spacecraft. You're always trying to fight against weight, just like you are in aeronautics. It's, important there too. But in this environment, it's even more critical. You obviously had a payload shroud above all this that protected things like the airlock module and all that other good stuff. But this part of the vehicle needed to remain streamlined, but it needed to have the shield around it. So they came up with this design that would keep it tightly wrapped around the tank, so to speak, but then deploy properly so that it could provide effective thermal shielding. Now, that kind of idea of it standing off from the tank, that's something, as I mentioned earlier, is a very common design you have in spacecraft, and even in things like the James Webb scope, the telescope. It has those multiple layers of shielding that are spaced apart using the same technique. It's dissipating more heat from shield to shield to shield. In this case, you actually had a gold shield underneath this that's permanently fixed to the tank, but you needed to have space between it and this deployable shield. Yeah, go ahead.
Dwight expresses his opinion. He says, no, this was a design error that they didn't consider upon launch. But I was basically asking you if based on the information that you have, were they at capacity for the rocket? Could they not have added any more things? Or was the design here meant to deploy itself, and if they had added something else on this, they would have not been able to deploy it except to have the astronauts go out into space and remove things in space that it could then deploy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't think that weight was a critical factor to it, and I will explain why in a moment as we get into a later phase of the accident, why that I think that's true. I can read for you something that's from the NASA investigative board on this accident, and this is a quote. "This failure to recognize the design deficiencies of the meteoroid shield through 6 years of analysis, design, and test was due, in part, to a presumption that the shield would be, quote, tight to the tank, unquote, and structurally integral with the S-4B tank as set forth in the design criteria. In practice, the meteoroid shield was a large, flexible, limp system that proved difficult to rig to the tank and to obtain the close fit that was presumed by that design. These design deficiencies of the meteoroid shield, as well as the failure to communicate within the project the critical nature of its proper venting, must therefore be attributed to an absence of sound engineering judgment and alert engineering leadership concerning this particular system over a considerable period of time."
Okay. Now, if you're ready to go to the next slide, that's actually the one that's the video, and then I have to pull up the video.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay.
I can set it up if you'd like first, but
Sure.
that'd probably be a good idea. Dwight found this clip, and I think, Dwight, you might have been the first person to actually find it. I'm not sure, but it's a rare clip of Skylab during the launch phase at about the time the accident occurred. And maybe, Dwight, you were able to ascertain that it was indeed during the time of the actual accident. I can't quite recall. But you may be able to spot the shield coming off of Skylab. I'm not sure if you can or not. It's very grainy. It's very hard to see, but you can see it in searching for Skylab, and we're about to look at it here.
Okay, so I'm going to go back. I'm going to pretend that I could go to the next slide, which I can't, and then I'm going to add this in.
Indicated to have occurred 1 minute and 3 seconds after liftoff.
So that's how quick the video is.
Right.
It's pretty hard to see anything in that.
It is. It's very grainy, obviously, probably taken from an Air Force aircraft. I'm not entirely sure. I just don't recall. So you might be able to see it. Everybody has to kind of make up their own mind whether or not they can see something coming off of the workshop at that point.
Well, we could look at it again. I could see if we can.
Roll malfunctions were indicated to have occurred 1 minute and 3 seconds after liftoff.
And that long-range camera just is very difficult to see anything from.
Yeah, it's blown up, as Dwight pointed out in the chat. It's zoomed in by a power of 8 for the film.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's why it's so grainy.
Okay, and then if we're ready for the next slide.
Sure. Okay, so in our story here, I mentioned that I would bring up the second stage again and also a little bit more detail about what's going on with these solar wings. Here we're looking again at Skylab on top of the second stage, because one of the next events that has to occur during the launch is that the second stage has to burn basically to completion of its propellants, or until it at least reaches the correct altitude and velocity, and then it has to separate from Skylab. And in order to accomplish that, there are these 4 retro rockets in the adapter that fire for about 2 seconds. However, remember that one of those solar array wings is partially swung out from the vehicle. It got ripped apart again, ripped open, if you will, by the deploying micrometeoroid shield. So when those motors fire, it pushes that solar array completely out to the extent of its hinge at a right angle and blows it completely off the vehicle, rips it out by the roots. It's gone. Goodbye. It's on its way into the Atlantic Ocean, never to be seen again. Okay, so next slide. Now, just getting a little bit better look here at what happens next, because no, we're not done yet. We're not done with the wicked way this shield had with the Saturn V, because that micrometeoroid shield, after punching a hole upstage there and being responsible for allowing that solar array to be ripped off, is now headed further down the Saturn V. And guess what it decides to do? It decides to impact on this joint that you have between the interstage and the second stage that you have in the area where the first and second stages are joined. If you look in this photo, there are these 2 white horizontal lines across that big black stripe on this interstage. This interstage is there on a Saturn V so that the first stage can fall away from it, and that interstage can then fall away separately several seconds later. It's something that rocket designers called dual plane separation. Now, the reason that you did this on a Saturn V is because, and stand by just a second, I want to check if I can explain this. Yeah, we already looked at it, sorry. There's a cluster of 5 engines inside that interstage, right? 5 of them. And they're pretty close inside that interstage. If you were to pull the first stage away as one big piece, that whole area of the interstage would slam into those 5 engines, probably. All you'd have to have is a little bit of yaw or pitch that would be incurred into that big, long first stage, and it could slam right into them, and then you have what NASA calls a bad day. So again, first stage falls away at the area of the lower white line. That's actually an environmental cover that covers a linear charge that separates everything. And then you have the second plane separate, so the interstage cleanly drops away. That micrometeoroid shield decided to hit that upper plane and damage and actually cause, just broke this initiator for one of those linear charges. In Skylab, you had two actual linear charges on it. It's a modification from the original Saturn V vehicle. You have one charge that fires around half the circumference of the inner stage, and another charge that's responsible for the other side. One of them got damaged because it got struck, the other one didn't. So it tries to separate by like 1/4 of an inch. The other one doesn't separate at all. And the inner stage is kind of hanging down a little bit from the bottom of the second stage, and it goes into orbit, and that's all really bad. Now, I'll tell you why. And it comes back to a question you asked a little bit earlier, Ken, and I promised I'd answer it. You probably guessed that it's bad because carrying the inner stage up into orbit like that is a problem of weight, right? You want to shed weight when you can shed it. That's part of the problem. But there's another big problem, a much worse problem, if a Saturn V can't get rid of its inner stage at this phase of the flight. And if you guess that that problem is heat, you are our Jeopardy champion for today, and you win the grand prize, because the main reason really you had to get rid of the inner stage is to allow those 5 J2 engines to shed heat effectively. If you couldn't get rid of the inner stage on a manned flight, and the guys in Houston knew that and detected it, that's an automatic abort of the flight. And you fire off a launch escape system, that escape tower on the top of the command module, and it pulls the command module away to safety. Because that kind of heat can compromise the whole vehicle and cause an explosion. This Saturn V carried that inner stage all the way into orbit, and it had the power to do that. It compensated for it. The normal way an S2 burns is it burns to depletion of its propellants, and then it stops, right? That's the way the S2 would burn. It had the power to do that. You know, the Skylab was much lighter than a typical S4B. It's not loaded with propellants. It's empty, essentially. So it was able to do so. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is what happens when an inner stage falls away the way it's supposed to. That's not what happened on Skylab. Again, part of it didn't fall away because of a damaged initiator. The other side of it did, just a little bit, by about 1/4 of an inch. NASA didn't really know, the Houston people didn't know this had happened until pretty close to the point where the Saturn S2 had stopped burning. The second stage was done. There's something else I was going to say about that. Oh, yeah. Here's an irony for you, another one. Normally speaking, on all the other Saturn V's previous to this, you had only one initiator through a primary channel that fired and blew all the way around that inner stage on the linear charge and blew it off. They thought on this Saturn V, you know, for redundancy's sake, let's modify that and have 2 initiators with 2 separate linear charges. And that's what caused this problem. It was concluded in the accident report that had they not made that modification for the sake of redundancy, this whole problem with the inner stage not coming off probably would not have happened. It would have shed itself the way it's supposed to. So there's an irony for you. Next slide.
Okay.
So when Skylab gets into orbit, it looks like this. This is a photo taken by the first visiting crew, commanded by Pete Conrad. And what you can see is, in the lower right, that solar wing is trapped by debris and only a little bit deployed and is basically useless in that position. The other solar wing, it's gone. Look in the center of the photo, and you can see wires sticking up there, ripped out by the roots. It's in the Atlantic somewhere. We'll never see it again. The rest of it, pretty good shape. The Apollo telescope mount is rotated properly into position. Its 4 solar panels have extended and are generating some power. But what you have again is an exposed orbital workshop, and that gold foil that's attached there, in the absence of the micrometeoroid shield, is starting to blacken in the sun. One thing I'll call attention to again, you might remember that I talked about that little scientific airlock module. you can see a small white square more or less in the center of that gold area with a black circle in it. That's the airlock module. And that became really important when it came to saving Skylab. Let's go to our next slide. Dwight is mentioning, whoops, sorry, missed that. There we go.
I can back up.
That's okay.
Said the tracking station folks saw there was something not right. They relayed this to Houston. It was not a fun time for them.
Yeah, there were some stressful times, not only for people on the ground, but for people that went up to actually fix this, namely Pete Conrad and his crewmates. Okay, so right away, NASA knew they had a problem. Temperatures are climbing inside the orbital workshop to over 100 degrees. And that's not something that's going to work for a crew that needs to work up there for a month or 2 months or even 3 months. Not only that, but you've got some things inside the orbital workshop that can start to spoil. You've got canned foods and so forth. Ironically, stuff they have in freezers on board, that's fine. That seems to be operating normally. It's okay. But there's something that's got to be done over two main problems. The station's getting too hot, and the station is underpowered because it's lost a whole solar wing and the other one can't produce really any power. So the idea eventually was developed out of several that the first crew to visit, which is Pete Conrad's crew, could bring up what looks in many ways like a big patio canopy or what's the word I'm looking for here? An umbrella, essentially. You can extend it out of that scientific airlock module from inside, push it all the way up, then extend the umbrella out, and then pull it back down flush against the station, and it would shade the station and cause it to cool down. And that idea worked. They trained on it in the neutral buoyancy tank at Marshall Space Flight Center. People like Rusty Schweikart and others worked very hard on this in working out the procedures for it. So the crew, despite the delay in their launch, got this umbrella loaded into their Apollo spacecraft, and they carried it aboard to install it. Although, remember, they have other problems to deal with, problems involving power and the solar wing. But let's go to one more slide we have here. So what will happen when the when Skylab 2 crew gets to the station is that they were able to deploy that ad hoc sun shield, and you can see it here. It's a little crooked, but it's working, and it's cooling down the station. But how did they get the solar wing out? Notice that that one's been deployed. Well, that involves some real work. The first thing that the crew tried when they flew up to the station was to take this big, like shepherd's crook with sort of a branch cutter on the end with a long pole. And while Pete Conrad flew the command module and they opened up the hatch, Paul Weitz, one of his teammates, leaned out of the hatch with this big long pole and tried to get that cutter end of it onto the debris that was trapping that solar wing. And immediately, in a situation like that, Newtonian physics kick in. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So now Pete Conrad is fighting to keep the command module from moving around as he's tugging and trying to push on this. Skylab is getting its attitude perturbed. Both things are moving around. They're having no luck. Conrad is starting to swear. Paul Weitz is starting to swear. And they decide this method isn't going to work. We'll go ahead and we'll dock with the station and we'll try something else later. So they go in. They had one docking with the station, what's called the soft dock. They had done that earlier. They try again to soft dock so they can do a hard dock with the station, and they can't do it. The docking probe on the command module won't engage. Now everybody gets really cranky. Joe Kerwin in the movie Searching for Skylab talks about we were facing a prospect here of being up there on the first couple of days and getting nothing done. No sun shield installed yet, no solar wing extended, that we had failed even to dock properly. Eventually, with a lot of work and really, frankly, some more cussing, they were able to repair the docking probe by depressurizing the command module while wearing spacesuits, obviously, rewiring it, and getting it to engage. They got a hard dock out of that. They got into the vehicle, and they were able to get the sun shield eventually deployed. The way they got that solar wing deployed is to do an EVA between Joe Kerwin and Pete Conrad, with Joe Kerwin going out again with that hook out onto the body of Skylab from the airlock module, with Pete Conrad behind him. And again, problems kick in, because for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. In a spacewalk, in an EVA, if you are not really thoroughly secured, you're going to move every time you push on something. In the movie, you're going to see a clip of Joe Kerwin bobbing around all over the place on a 16 millimeter piece of footage as Pete Conrad is trying to coach him on what to do. No, pull the tether. What tether? That tether you've got on the hook. I've got there is, which tether do you mean? Damn it. Wait a minute. Okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do here. We're going to get in the proper configuration. I was in the proper configuration. Well, what happened eventually is that they figured out that if they took one of the tethers, they put it over Kerwin's shoulder and fixed it to this little attachment point on Skylab, that it could bind him in a standing position with his feet against Skylab, being held down by the tether. And as Joe Kerwin says in the movie, I was as stable as a judge. I could get that cutter right on that piece of metal, cut it, and the solar wing goes like that and tosses Conrad and Kerwin out at the end of their tethers, as Pete Conrad once said, ass over tea kettles, to the end of the tethers. But they were fine. They could pull themselves back into the airlock module. They had saved the Skylab. They had gotten all the power they needed to do all the experiments that were projected for the whole program. And you have a happy ending to the story.
Yep. Earlier, Alexander was saying, I'm baffled to this day how Dwight found the footage of that scene, the actual accident. I'm sort of baffled too, because I couldn't find it when we were looking for it either.
Yeah, Dwight would have to tell you. I don't remember the exact story behind it. But, he's pretty ingenious about that kind of thing, I can tell you. And he doesn't give up.
Okay. Well, we have gone roughly over an hour. I want you to talk more about your next book project.
Sure. Well, it just seemed like a logical extension from what I wrote about in the article about lunar orbit rendezvous. Well, if you're going to agree that that's the best way to get to the moon, what kind of a vehicle do you need to design and build to do that job? And that's the lunar module, or LEM. So it seemed interesting to me, when you read about what a struggle that was, because the Grumman Aerospace Company, which was the main contractor on that vehicle out of Bethpage, Long Island, had to start after everybody else did. They had to start after North American did on building the second stage and building the command service module. They had to start after McDonnell Douglas, who had already been building S4Bs for the Saturn 1B rather. They started late, and they had to build something that had never been built before, a pure space vehicle, one never meant to work in Earth's atmosphere, and one that was going to land human beings on another world and get them out again. So that struggle, and this is something I mean to open the book with, culminates over several years, as I mentioned earlier, not only to get the weight down and get it working, but to deal with things like, while you're getting the weight down, trying to make sure that things stay together, don't break and don't leak. And Grumman delivers their very first lunar module called LEM-1, which is built to do an unmanned test on a Saturn 1B. And they get it to Kennedy Space Center, and they had tested it in New York, found it seemed to be fine. They get it out at Kennedy Space Center, and they start testing it. They start testing it on the ground, and it leaks. It leaks from its propellants. It leaks from the oxidizer. It leaks from the fuel. It leaks. And the launch center director, a man by the name of Rocco Petrone, who is and looks like what his name sounds like, fires off this letter to Grumman that is just scathing. He said, I wouldn't let this piece of junk on any one of my launch pads. It leaks like a sieve, and it's 6 months late besides. And it goes on from there and on and on and on. What you ended up finding in all of that, and what was concluded is, while Grumman had to do their testing, they're the ones who built it. You really, in the final analysis, don't want the same people who build something to be the ones who do the final testing. There was a certain objectivity that seemed to be lost. And when you got at the Kennedy Space Center with different and more rigorous methods, they uncovered flaws in the vehicle that had to be rectified. That was just a constant all the way through. I mean, these are things that even resulted in problems that occurred in all the manned flights later as they tried to shake this vehicle down and get it working. Problems that happened on Apollo 9 when the first crew flew one in Earth orbit, Apollo 10 when they flew it in lunar orbit, and of course on Apollo 11 when they did the first landing. And it's fascinating how those problems just crept up and how they ended up dealing with them. There are a lot of last minute changes done on the lunar module for Apollo 11 on the pad. I mean, those plume deflectors that come down from the RCS engines on the lunar module that you saw on all the lunar modules that landed on the moon, those were added just, days before the landing on the pad inside the Saturn lunar adapter by crews working inside of there. Extra thermal shielding around the landing gear was all added at the last minute. Those plume deflectors I'm referring to, they ended up being the cause of some of the communication problems that Eagle, the lunar module, had during the initial powered descent to the moon, where you keep hearing breakup. And Buzz Aldrin is talking about putting the S-band dish antenna on the lunar module into slew so he could manually try to orient it, and yawing the LEM around. It was trying to look through a coal chute, a plume deflector that hadn't been there in previous designs, and it was blocking the transmission signal. Who knew? Who thought ahead on that? So these are the kinds of things that can bite you when you make changes and you have unintended consequences. That kind of stuff is just redolent through the program of developing the lunar module, and to certainly a degree through much of the rest of the development of other components of Apollo.
Mm-hmm. So there's just a lot of backstories to tell, basically, that much of the public has probably never heard before.
Yeah. I want to talk a lot about details in the book, but the human stories behind them are quite critical. So whenever you read history, if you don't see how people are involved and how people struggle and how people overcome things or fail to do so, the history gets rather dry. Mm-hmm. That's something I think it's critical about writing any history. I was dissuaded from writing history about Apollo for a long time because I kept thinking, well, what idea am I going to come up with that somebody hasn't already written about? And I started thinking about, well, look, how many books are there on the Civil War? A whole lot. How many times has the Civil War been written about? How many times has the Battle of Gettysburg been written about? How many times maybe has Pickett's charge at Gettysburg been written about? But people still keep writing those books, and people still keep reading them, because it kind of goes back to where we were when we were little kids, when you went to bed and mom or dad came in and you said, tell me a story. I want to hear it in your voice. I want to hear the way you tell it. It's different than anybody else has ever told it before. So we'll see if my theory holds.
Mm-hmm. Alexandra says, so glad, Carl, that you decided to go ahead with that book.
Thank you. It's going to be a long time coming. I tell you that.
And if you missed the comment before, Dwight said the Skylab story is a plethora of information. Alexander says your book already sounds fascinating. And Dwight says we better get a signed copy as soon as possible.
Well, you better wait until I get it done, and that's going to be a while because I'm still working full time, buddy, just like you are. My time to work on it is a little limited, but I squeeze it in where I can. I may be hitting you up for research on things too. Sometimes I can't find stuff I want to find.
Mm-hmm. So we're about an hour and 15 minutes. We're at what I consider the minimum time for the show. So I will ask you the last question, unless the audience has specific questions that they want to ask first. So audience, do you have any questions you want to ask first? Not seeing any yet. They might need a little bit of time. Dwight says, by all means, tell me what you need in regards to your book.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I will.
But I don't see the audience asking any questions, so I'm just going to ask the final question. What would you like to share with the audience before we close out this episode of this show? And that pretty much gives you carte blanche to talk about, side projects, things that you support, other things that you want people to know about you or what. And then, of course, a question came in from Dwight. Carl, where did you get that cool shirt?
eBay. And I can't tell you exactly sold it, but I found it on eBay and I bought it. It's short sleeve because it's kind of warm here today, although for a lot of you, I know it's not that bad. It's probably in the mid 80s out here in Anaheim today, and that's Fahrenheit. So that's not too bad for probably compared to where you are, Ken.
It was 92, 93 here today.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting into some pretty hot days because we haven't had much rain this part of the week.
Things I'd like to tell people about. Well, I'm a member of the Planetary Society and the National Space Society, and I give whatever support I can through those. Obviously, it's important, I think, to be involved and make sure that space advocacy gets the shoulder to the wheel that it needs all the time. NASA's budget is looking at some cuts because of measures that were put in place by this Congress to cut everything. We may end up having a delay or cancellation of the Mars sample return mission as a consequence to that. And God knows what might happen again to the Artemis program and the attempt to land once again on the moon, which is going to cost and is costing a lot of money, obviously. But, be cognizant of the fact that when people complain about the amount of money spent in Apollo, you ask them, what do you think we were spending there in terms of a percentage of the national budget? And they'll think, well, like 40 or 50%. Peak spending in the mid-60s was maybe as much as 4% peak spending when we were really pouring money into this. And now it's about 0.5%. And to quote Neil deGrasse Tyson, what I would advocate for is taking that 0.5% and doubling it. Mm-hmm. I think that's reasonable.
Dwight says, if you can believe it, I learned a lot today.
Oh, well, thank you, Dwight. That's quite praise indeed.
The discussion today. Alexander says, I think Skylab was approximately 2% of the budget.
Yeah, I don't know. You would know better than I on that one. I mean, because so much of that stuff is already
with
built.
Skylab, that was the one beautiful, fascinating thing that I learned from the movie. Many fascinating things, obviously, I learned from the movie, and I enjoyed the movie very much, Searching for Skylab. And we will put up the link at the end of the show in the show close, but basically searching for skylab.com.
Also available on Vimeo for streaming.
And Heidi says this has been fascinating. The thing that I learned that I didn't know, 1973, I was 12 years old. And I didn't really realize that Skylab was excess parts from the Apollo mission turned into a lab.
Mm-hmm.
That was really fascinating to learn that they had, put things together. And the other thing that I thought that was fascinating is that, they expected it to last in orbit a lot longer. And obviously, if the space shuttle had been on time and flown earlier in 79 instead of 81, they were hoping to be able to dock the space shuttle with it, but the space shuttle took longer to develop than they expected.
Yeah, and there was more expansion of the Earth's atmosphere due to increased solar activity that put more drag on Skylab, which is what brought it down sooner than they thought it would. Dwight was afraid it would come down on his house. Fortunately, it didn't.
Dwight points out we got the last interviews with Paul Weitz, Bruce McCandless, and Owen Garriott for the movie.
Yeah, they were members of the Skylab crews, several of them, and have passed away since, but you will see the interviews with these gentlemen. Bruce McCandless has some interesting footprints in history, too. For one, he is the first person to do an untethered spacewalk. There are famous pictures of him floating in this manned maneuvering unit out of the space shuttle, and that's Bruce. Nobody had ever done that before. He's also the guy that was the Capcom during the Apollo 11 moonwalk. And you hear Houston communicating with him during the moonwalk. That's Bruce. That is Bruce McCandless as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, if the audience has not got any more questions or comments, there is a comment here from Alexandra, and I'm not sure who she's speaking about. Said he regretted not finding any of the Skylab pieces too. Is that McCandless?
I think that's Dwight.
Or Dwight?
Probably she's talking about Dwight. Dwight's an Australian, so.
Dwight says yes, and now it's called Skylab instead of Skylab.
Yeah, he's from Australia. He and Alexandra are living in Germany, but he's got that delightful accent that we all love.
We around here in the Space Center area, we see like these pieces of rockets. There's somebody that's got one, and they put it like on the local highway, and they're selling it. Trying to get people to buy it, but I don't know. You got to have expendable cash to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, I personally can't buy any of that stuff on spacecollect.com or anything. I don't have the money for that. We have vet bills with our cats. And
White says I have several pieces of Skylab. So
Skylab. Right. You got them all mounted up there, Dwight? You got them on the wall in a frame or your shadow box or something like that?
Well, I will immediately extend this offer that when you are releasing or talking about your book, if you'd like to come back on, you can contact me and we can do another show.
Love to. Again, it's going to take a while, but I'd love to.
But that would probably help you promote your book. And I hope that by having you on today that I, see more authors interested. I tried to have this show be specifically about people that worked in the space program, but it just kind of got to the point where people would say they were going to appear, but they never did. And then I think a lot of people, they only want to talk to their own community. They want to keep their stories to themselves, or they feel like perhaps, I'm speculating here, but I feel like in some ways they think that, these stories only relate to people that worked in that core community. So it's hard to say why they don't talk to me. It's just speculation on my part. But I think that, by having you on today, it's possible that I could have more authors on And so I hope that that works that way. And certainly if you find other authors that are interested in speaking, send them my way.
Okay, we can chat about that. I do know a few that have become friends of mine over the years that could be interested. I can hit them up and see what they think.
Dwight puts in chat, he says, I would love to have a chat with you. Dwight, yeah, you can get my communication information from Carl, and I'll work around your schedule. It'll be my Saturday at some point, but we'll try to make it, more apropos for your time zone.
Yeah. 1 a.m. out there, actually later by now.
Unless you like talking at this time in your time zone. But, just let me know what you'd like to do. I mean, my audience is really small right now, so it's not like I have to do things at a specific time. I do with my other talk show. People do come on and, watch it later. So I think I'll have some viewers watch this later when they realize, oh, he did a show again, So.
Well, I really appreciate it. It's always fun for me to talk about this stuff, and I can obviously go on and on.
Right. So I will mention that I will try to get together on the July 4th holiday when I have free time for myself, and I will try to lift the audio from this show, probably leave out these end of show comments and put it in audio podcast form. And then, it'll be up where people can listen to it, because sometimes it's easier for people to listen to it. I think. Do I have that banner?
Is the show available on YouTube or Facebook when we're done here, or is that going to?
Yeah, it's on Facebook and YouTube, and it'll stay on Twitch for about a week. So, it'll be up there, and I will, shoot you the links again, I guess, but it's going to be the same links that were live. There's really not much difference with that.
Okay.
So,
I've got those.
So that's pretty much it, folks. That's Slightly Off Axis podcast. My guest has been Carl Alessi. Thank you very much for being with us today, Carl.
Again, thank you.
Okay. We're going to wrap up this show. It's been a joy. Thank you to our people in the audience, Dwight, Alexandra, and Heidi. Can you do a joint interview with Carl? Yes, you could.
That'd be great.
Yeah, because you might find more stuff to talk about that way, and I'd love it. So we'll just, we'll see what you want to do. We'll reach out to each other and get that set up. If you want to do it next Saturday, we'll do that next Saturday.
I'm probably free.
But if you want to wait a few weeks or something, we'll just see.
Yeah, you let me know. I usually, after house show, I've got time on Saturday afternoons. I'm just doing errands and chores around the house.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm not going to ramble on and on and on and on and on. I've done enough of that, but it's been very informative. And as I said before, as I play the close, you're free to. I haven't said this before, so I will say this now. As I play the close, you're free to chat with each other in the chat. Carl can join you in chat if he wants to. I can as well. But, once the close starts playing, we won't see each other. We won't be hearing each other talk. And we'll do this other thing. Dwight asks, where's your cat? I did see your cat a couple of times.
Fergus is roaming around here somewhere. Ariel, the other cat, is up on top of my bookcase behind up that away, sleeping up there. So they're here. But Fergus took off. He's usually something of a nervous wreck sometimes.
Okay. But anyway, I'm going to play this, and I did mention it earlier, and I think everybody heard, but if you didn't, when I play the close, it's going to have the website in it. And, you know, obviously, if you come up with more websites or links or communications that you want to put in the next show, when we all have a show together, obviously get those to me so that we put all that in the close so that people can find all that information. Dwight says, I have many dark secrets from Carl that I will share. Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Remember that old dictum, Dwight? An attack on a single axis invites a counterattack on the same axis.
And with that, I'm going to play the close before we get into too much trouble. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Feel free to share the show with your friends. Thanks. Bye.